So, you want to make a reboot. When is that a good idea, though? What's your motivation behind it? Well, besides... Let's have a conversation about when stories should and shouldn't get rebooted, in my opinion, as always. Let's talk about motivation for rebooting something. Now, the first and most apparent motivation from the studio side is, well, it's money, obviously. Now, I get it. Everybody likes making money, at least to some degree, and repurposing a recognizable brand is a pretty solid way to make some money in the film business. Now, to be very clear, I have absolutely no problem with people or companies trying to make money, provided they aren't being extraordinarily shitty in the way they do it. But I don't think it should ever be the sole reason a property is rebooted. If it is, the new film or series will appear soulless more often than not. I think there needs to be some sort of creative spark there, which we'll talk about more in the rest of the video. But it is very clear to an audience when something is only a cash grab. You can practically smell it in the marketing. Now, I will make clear that I understand that money is at least part of the motivation of any rebooted property, or most properties in general, but it isn't always the sole driving force behind them. And on that note, let's transition into some of the more creative motivations for making a reboot. One reason I think many of these are made is that someone behind the project had an idea for a different or even unique take on a property that they want to explore. Maybe this is meant to capitalize off modern trends in filmmaking or just to pursue an interesting idea in the filmmaker's heads, or both. But I think this is one of the more acceptable reasons to reboot something. It brings something new to the table, or at least tries to. This has happened a lot in the last 20 years with public domain characters. Take Sherlock Holmes. You have the Robert Downey Jr. ones, the BBC series, Elementary, House, and probably more that I can't remember. Each of these series takes essential elements of Sherlock Holmes characters, but they put their own spin on them and make them into unique things. House changes the Holmes archetype from a detective to a doctor. The Downey Jr. films put more of a stylized action slant to the series. BBC's show modernizes Holmes and Watson, as does Elementary, that also changes Watson to a female character. All of these interpretations are extremely distinct from each other, but all are reboots of the Arthur Conan Doyle stories in one way or another. Robin Hood and King Arthur are other examples of this motivation in practice. Neither property has enjoyed the modern success that Sherlock Holmes has, but they have both had pretty distinct takes in the last 20 years. King Arthur, Legend of the Sword is vastly different from 2000's King Arthur starring Clive Owen and Keira Knightley. The new Taron Egerton starring Robin Hood is a massive tonal and stylistic shift from the Ridley Scott version starring Russell Crowe. Now, you may like some of these movies more or less than others, but I think this is one of the stronger reasons to reboot, because at least the filmmakers are trying to bring something new to the table. We now live in a world where there exists a pretty down-to-earth, realistic Robin Hood movie, as well as a hyper-stylized vigilante story Robin Hood movie. And it's not like they're really hurting anybody. Another reason one might reboot something is to bring a super old property back into the limelight and try and introduce it to newer generations. Now, this one is tricky, and I'm of two minds about it. On the one hand, there's definitely some crossover with my last example, and new ideas can and often are introduced in these types of remakes. It can also introduce younger people to older properties that they may not have explored otherwise. For example, the 2009 Star Trek reboot was my introduction to Star Trek. I knew a decent amount about the original series in TNG, but I'd never watched them or really had much interest in exploring them. After the movie, though, I ended up renting a bunch of old Star Trek and watching them with my family, and we really enjoyed that. On the other hand, though, people may see the rebooted version as a replacement for the original. Many people have the mentality that newer is always better, which is kind of sad, but it's also a bit true. But there's a lot of value in going back and watching older films for many reasons, including giving you a perspective on past eras of our culture, the development of the filmmaking craft, exposure to influences of filmmakers who may be currently influencing you, etc. For example, I've always enjoyed the sequences in the Indiana Jones movies where he's traveling and they have his flight or boat or whatever overlaid with the map following his route. Then, a few years ago in film class, I was watching Casablanca for the first time. Fantastic movie that everybody should watch, but I saw this same thing done at the beginning of that movie and realized that this is probably where Spielberg and Lucas saw this and most likely included it in the indie films as a reference to Casablanca. Now, it's important to have an understanding of history for many reasons beyond film, but I think with regards to film history specifically, rebooting old properties could do some damage to most people's drive to explore that history. This one rides a pretty thin line for me because it could go either way depending on the receptiveness of the audience. I always enjoy seeing where things come from, so I explore. I don't think most people are like that, though. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. One twist on the last motivation that is pretty common currently is the late sequel. And what I mean by this is a film that is a sequel to the original movies, but also manages to sort of serve as a reboot of the original. This is an interesting one. The Force Awakens is a really good example of this. All the original characters are there, but are much older and serve as supporting characters for the new leads. These types of films manage to functionally reboot older franchises for younger generations without eliminating previous events from the canon of the series. And these are a pretty effective way of rebooting something, as it still draws on elements that made the original work and continues the story. It can be dangerous, though, as you run the risk of making story decisions that your fanbase doesn't like. For a lot of people, this seems to be the case with the new Star Wars films. I don't really understand a large majority of the problems this sector of the fanbase has with the new films, but that's not the point I'm making in this video. The point here is that this approach is a risk if not done carefully, as you can alienate your built-in audience you already have. It can work really well, as, in my opinion, it has with Star Wars, or it can drag down something that was already perfectly concluded and really didn't need to be continued. To sum it all up, I really believe that you need to have a pretty solid creative motivation to reboot something. Audiences are getting more savvy and can spot when there isn't any creative drive behind a project. Most of the big movies are made with an intention of making money, and as I said earlier, I have no issue with that, but there needs to be something more. I'll state for the record, though, that more often than not, a reboot probably is not necessary. That being said, having a reboot of something doesn't mean the original is disappearing. I'm not upset about the Ghostbusters reboot. It didn't look very good, and I didn't go see it because of that, but it's not impeding my ability to watch the original movie, and maybe this movie got some young people to go back and explore the original. A way I think reboots would be more creatively viable, though, is this. Take a movie that had a promising idea but failed in the execution on some level and rework it to try and bring out the full potential of that idea. This is how I think about artists covering music. Like, why would you try to cover an artist's most popular song? People do it, but you probably won't do it better than they did. But take a song that didn't resonate with most people and bring it back in your own way. Maybe that's the way you should reboot something. You see unrealized potential and want to bring it to the surface so others can see what you see. And that's going to do it for this week's video. I hope everyone's been having a great holiday. Let me know what your thoughts are about reboots down below. Maybe say what your favorite and least favorite reboots are. That sounds interesting. Also, if you enjoyed this video, maybe subscribe and drop a like. That would really help me out a bunch. And with all that being said, I'll see y'all in 2 weeks. Have a good one.